In a peaceful park under the afternoon sun, trust is shattered in seconds. One missing necklace. One man judged by the color of his skin. But what they didn't see was his history, his power, and his quiet resolve. By the end of this story, hearts will be broken, eyes will be opened, and justice will have a face. Dear viewer, what you are about to witness is not just a story. It is a powerful testament to the quiet power and pursuit of justice in places most people ignore. If this is your first time here, I warmly invite you to share where you are watching in the comments below. And if stories like this move you, challenge you, or make you think, consider subscribing and clicking the bell icon. We share voices that deserve to be heard every day. Thank you for being here. Now let's get into the story. The late afternoon light slanted across Millennium Park like a whisper, golden and quiet, casting long shadows across the stone paths. The hum of the city faded into background murmurs as birds fluttered between the oaks, and the air carried the scent of roasted almonds and wind-swept leaves. On a long iron bench beneath a cluster of sugar maples, three strangers sat side by side, their silhouettes brushed by the sun's descent. Elijah Brooks was the kind of man people might overlook if they weren't paying attention. 65 years old, skin the color of polished mahogany, with neatly trimmed silver hair, and eyes like polished onyx, watchful still. He wore a navy blue sports coat loafers that shone despite the dust of the park, and a pair of reading glasses resting on the bridge of his nose. In his hands was a worn leather-bound book, its edges curled from decades of turning pages. To his left sat Julie Langdon, a former gallery curator in her 50s, dressed in a flowing cream scarf and sunglasses that never quite hid the sharpness in her gaze. To his right was Maggie Cole, a retired schoolteacher with laugh lines that told stories even when her lips didn't move. The three had struck up conversation not long after Elijah offered Maggie his seat, and Julie had joined soon after with a sketch pad in hand. They had talked about art travel, the chaos of the city, and the strange beauty of growing older. What began as casual park bench chatter had quickly become a shared moment of rare stillness, three lives brushing for a fleeting hour of connection. But beneath that calm surface, something else stirred. Julie glanced down at her bag, a sleek leather tote placed neatly beside her. A subtle frown crossed her face. She reached in, shuffled through, then looked again, more urgently this time. Her fingers scraped the bottom. Then she stood, checked the ground near her feet, turned her bag upside down, and the contents spilled out in a quiet clatter. Keys, lipstick, a phone, a few receipts, no necklace. It was a necklace passed down through 3 generations. Gold antique, etched with initials only she knew. And now it was gone. Her breath caught. She looked around the bench at the grass at her companions. Maggie leaned over to help brows furrowed in concern. But then Julie's eyes stopped right on Elijah. There was no accusation spoken, not yet. But her lips tightened and her body stiffened. She didn't need to say it. The shift in her posture said enough. Maggie seemed to sense it too, though she hesitated, caught between friendship and implication. The silence was brief, but loud. Elijah looked up from his book, brows raised gently. Something wrong. Julie's voice trembled with restraint. I had a necklace. Right here. Now it's gone. Maggie touched her shoulder. Maybe it fell behind the bench. But Julie wasn't looking at the bench anymore. She was staring at Elijah, And when she spoke again, her voice was quieter, harder. You were the only one here when I stepped away. The air turned brittle. The warmth of the sun couldn't cut through the sudden cold that dropped between them. Elijah closed his book slowly. His hands didn't tremble. His voice didn't rise. You think I took it? Julie blinked. I didn't say that. You didn't have to, he said softly. Maggie opened her mouth, then closed it. She glanced down at the contents on the ground. Her face wore a look of discomfort, the kind that crawls in when suspicion creeps too close to civility. A few nearby parkgoers had turned their heads. Whispers buzzed faintly like insects. In the distance, the steady thump of boots on concrete grew louder. A uniformed officer approached, pulled by a call from the security booth. He was tall, built like a linebacker with a shaved head and mirrored sunglasses that reflected back the world in cold, anonymous slices. Everything all right here? He asked, stepping into their circle. Julie stood quickly, relief flashing across her face. Officer, I think I've been robbed. The officer's eyes swept the scene. 2 white women, one distressed. One elderly black man, calm but outnumbered. It didn't take him long to make assumptions. They never do. What's your name, sir? The officer asked Elijah, not unkindly, but already positioning his authority like a shield. Elijah Brooks. Mind standing up for me, Mr. Brooks? Maggie interjected. Wait, I don't think. The officer raised a hand. Just a routine check, ma'am. Nothing to worry about. But Elijah had already stood. Slowly. With grace. With dignity that filled the space between them. He met the officer's mirrored gaze without blinking. No problem, officer, he said. Just one request. Before you reach for your cuffs, you might want to know who you're talking to. The air held its breath, and in that one moment between the truth and the assumption, between past and present, between prejudice and justice, something shifted. None of them knew it yet, but everything was about to change. The tension in Millennium Park thickened like fog rolling in from Lake Michigan. Officer Granger's stance was firm, his hand resting just inches from the radio clipped to his shoulder. Behind his mirrored sunglasses, his eyes flicked from Julie to Elijah, calculating, scanning for cues. The quiet shuffle of joggers and dog walkers carried on in the background, but on that iron bench beneath the trees, time had slowed to a crawl. Julie stood like a statue, arms crossed tightly over her chest. She was visibly shaken, but it was the kind of shaken that calcifies into anger. She didn't shout. She didn't cry. Instead, she stepped closer to the officer, her voice low but trembling. Officer, I left for 5 minutes to take a call. When I came back, my necklace was gone. It was in my bag. A family heirloom. He's the only one who was here. Granger nodded emotion that looked more like confirmation than listening. He turned to Elijah. Sir, I'm going to need to take a quick look through your belongings. You understand. Elijah remained still. I understand that you're reacting based on an assumption, not evidence. Come on, Granger replied, his tone sharpening. We've got a complaint, and you're the only one who Maggie stepped in, then placing herself ever so slightly between the officer and Elijah. Officer, with all due respect, I've been sitting next to him for the past hour. He hasn't moved. He didn't even stand up. And Julie, maybe it slipped under the bench or got caught in your scarf. Let's not jump to Julie. Cut in. Voice icy. Maggie, I'm not accusing anyone blindly. But her eyes never left Elijah. That gaze, once friendly and curious, had soured into something brittle, an undercurrent of fear dressed as concern. The kind of fear that doesn't need facts, just familiarity with a narrative that's played out too many times on evening news. Elijah's expression didn't waver. His hand stayed visible. His voice remained steady, but something behind his eyes flickered an old, familiar ache. Not rage, not even surprise. Just the weight of being too used to this moment. I've spent my entire life serving this country. He said, his voice smooth but firm. I've worn a badge longer than some of you have been alive. And yet, I'm still standing here, being treated like a suspect on a park bench, because that's what you see first. Officer Granger's jaw shifted, caught between protocol and perception. Sir, with all due respect. No, Elijah said quietly, but with the force of a gavel. Respect isn't something you add as a footnote. It's what you lead with. And right now, you're not leading with it. Julie looked away, suddenly unsure of her own certainty. Maggie touched her shoulder gently, trying to tether her to something more human than suspicion. Julie, please. We were all just talking. You said you admired his grace. Julie's lips pressed together. Her eyes searched the ground as if the necklace might magically appear, absolving her of the growing guilt curling in her stomach. Officer Granger glanced down at Elijah's leather satchel resting neatly at his feet. Sir, I need you to open your bag. Elijah paused. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, he bent down, unzipped the satchel, and opened it wide. A book, a notebook, a fountain pen, an old photograph in a worn wallet. Nothing more, nothing less. He looked up, unblinking. Would you like to search my shoes next? Granger's hand dropped from his radio. No, sir. That won't be necessary. But the moment had already left its stain. And then from behind them, a voice, a small, startled gasp broke the silence. A jogger, pausing nearby, knelt down just beside the bench. Is this what you're looking for? She asked, holding up a delicate gold necklace caught in a tuft of grass just beneath the bench's shadow. All eyes turned to the chain dangling in the sunlight. Julie's breath caught in her throat. Oh my God, she whispered. The jogger offered a tentative smile. It must have slipped out of the bag when you set it down. Julie stepped forward, on shaking legs, accepting the necklace, with hands that trembled, not from relief, but from something far heavier. She turned toward Elijah, her mouth open, but no words came. Her pride, always well-dressed, was now threadbare in the face of what she had assumed, of what she had risked with just a few words and a glance. Elijah looked at her, not with scorn, not with fury, but with something far more disarming understanding. And maybe that was what cut the deepest. I'm sorry, Julie finally managed. Voice small, broken. I was scared. And you weren't scared of the necklace, Elijah said gently. You were scared of what it would mean if it was missing, and who it would be easiest to blame. Julie's eyes filled with tears. I didn't want to be that person. Then don't be, he replied. Not now. Not tomorrow. Not when no one's watching. Officer Granger shifted uncomfortably, the weight of his authority feeling misplaced now. Sir, I apologize as well. Elijah nodded once, slowly. I hope you remember this the next time someone like me gets asked to prove they belong. No anger. No lectures. Just truth, sharp and necessary. As the sun dipped lower into the skyline, casting elongated shadows over the park, the mood began to shift. The tension that had gripped that corner of Millennium Park started to loosen its hold. But for those who had felt its weight, the memory would linger. Trust once given freely on a sunlit bench had been fractured. Doubt, even momentary, had rewritten an entire hour. And yet somehow Elijah remained steady, a quiet force, not because he hadn't been shaken, but because he knew how to stand even in the storm. Under the golden canopy of fading afternoon light, Officer Granger stood at the edge of his own unraveling. The necklace had been found, the tension on the bench diffused, and yet something deeper gnawed at him. The apology he'd given Elijah was mechanical, a rehearsed reflex pulled from the training manuals he'd memorized but never embodied. Something in the way Elijah had met his gaze, steady, unflinching, and deeply human, had pierced a place he didn't know was vulnerable, a place where assumptions and power had lived unchallenged. Granger walked away from the scene, slowly each footstep, heavy not from physical fatigue, but from the emotional weight of what had just transpired. He made his way to a nearby patrol car, leaning against it with a sigh that caught in his throat. His partner, Officer Callahan, approached with a bottle of water in hand and a furrowed brow. "You good?" Callahan asked. Granger nodded, but said nothing. He was not good, because something inside him had just shifted, and not gently. What he had experienced wasn't just a misunderstanding. It was exposure, and exposure always leaves a sting. For years, Granger had patrolled Chicago's park streets and suburbs with a confidence that came from unspoken rules. Rules that placed people like him, white uniformed armed, on the right side of suspicion, and men like Elijah Black, older soft-spoken, on the other. These weren't rules he was taught outright, but they had been passed down in glances and off-the-record conversations at the precinct, in the way reports were filed, or not filed, depending on who was involved. He didn't hate black men. He didn't think of himself as racist. But today, in front of a park bench and a lost necklace, he had drawn a line not based on evidence, but instinct. An instinct shaped by years of narratives that painted blackness as threat and whiteness as default. That realization made his hands tremble. Back at the bench, Elijah remained seated. Maggie hadn't left. Neither had Julie. The silence between them had turned contemplative. The storm had passed, but its echo remained. Julie sat on the far end of the bench, her gaze low, fiddling with the chain now back around her neck. Her earlier certainty had dissolved into something messier regret. "I didn't know," she whispered suddenly, "about your background, about who you are." Elijah gave a slow nod, but didn't look at her. "That's the thing," he said, his voice rich with something more than sadness. "You shouldn't have to." Julie blinked, confused. "You shouldn't need a title or a badge to believe someone deserves fairness," he continued. "I've carried both, and I've still been followed through stores, pulled over, second-guessed. Today wasn't new. It was just public." Julie's face flushed. She wanted to interrupt to defend herself, but there was no defense strong enough to hide behind, not anymore. Meanwhile, Granger was still by the squad car, now alone, flipping through the pages of his notepad, but not writing anything, just holding the pen, just pretending he had something to record. A sound from behind made him glance up. It was Maggie. She had approached quietly, as if understanding that the real work wasn't in yelling, but in asking the right question. "Do you want to understand what just happened?" she asked. Granger's first instinct was to bristle. Defensive pride swelled in his chest, the kind that told him he'd followed procedure. But then he looked into Maggie's eyes, earnest, tired, honest, and something disarmed him. I don't think I do, he admitted, but I think I need to. Maggie nodded slowly. Then maybe it's time to stop thinking of people as profiles and start seeing them as stories. Granger frowned. That sounds like a slogan. It's a lived truth, she said. One I've had to learn by sitting beside people like Elijah, hearing what they carry, what they survive. Not just once, but every day. He looked down again, feeling exposed. He didn't even flinch. He wasn't afraid. He wasn't afraid of you, Maggie corrected. He was afraid of what you represent. The system, the power, the pattern. Granger exhaled. I wasn't trying to profile him. I was doing my job. No, she said gently but firmly. You are doing the job you think you're supposed to do. There's a difference. He nodded once, barely perceptible. And for the first time in years, he didn't feel like the man with the authority. He felt like the student. Back at the bench, Elijah had finally stood. The moment had passed, but the scar would remain, not as a wound, but as a reminder. He turned to Julie. You want to make it right? He asked. Yes, she said quickly. I do. Then do better. Not just with me, with everyone, especially when it's inconvenient. She nodded, eyes wet. Elijah gave a soft smile, then began walking toward the edge of the park. Officer Granger watched him go, knowing instinctively that he'd just met someone who had seen through him in a way no superior officer ever had. And for the first time, he wanted to earn that man's respect, not through rank, not through rules, but through change. Later that night, in a quiet corner of the precinct, Granger sat at his desk alone. The form in front of him wasn't a complaint. It was a self-initiated review. An incident report not about Elijah, but about himself, about what he'd done and what he hadn't done. He stared at the blank lines and finally began to write. Because the invisible line he had once drawn was no longer invisible. It was undeniable. It was real, and he was ready to cross it, not to the other side, but to the truth. The next morning arrived like any other in Chicago, but for Officer Granger, nothing felt ordinary. He sat at his desk in the precinct, surrounded by the white noise of printers' conversations and the distant sound of police radios crackling to life. And yet he heard none of it. The weight of the day before still pressed against his chest like a tight vest he couldn't take off. He replayed the moment Elijah revealed his background, not as a threat, but as a mirror. Granger hadn't seen himself clearly until then, until he was forced to. His fingers hovered over his keyboard, his cursor blinking on a blank screen. The form he was about to fill wasn't for the public. It wasn't even mandated. It was personal. A supplemental incident report, a confession of sorts, a moment of reckoning in black and white. But before he could begin typing, a soft knock came at the door. It was Maggie. You have a minute? She asked gently. Granger nodded, gesturing toward the chair across from him. She sat down, folding her hands on her lap. I wanted to thank you, she said, for how you handled things yesterday. I know it didn't start the right way, but the way it ended that mattered. Granger's expression tightened. I'm not sure handled is the word I'd use. Maggie gave him a kind but piercing look. You could have doubled down. A lot of officers would have. You didn't. He looked away. I didn't act fast enough. I didn't listen soon enough. But you did listen, she said. That's the first thing that needs to change before anything else can. He absorbed her words quietly. She was right. Listening, real listening, wasn't about hearing with the ears. It was about absorbing with the heart. And for the first time in his career, he was doing both. Later that day, a quiet ripple began forming in the department. Word of the park incident had spread not through reports, but through people. Dispatchers were whispering. Junior officers were asking questions. Some took it as gossip. Others saw it as gospel. But a few, the ones who mattered most, leaned in and wanted to know more. Granger walked down to the Internal Affairs Division on the third floor, clutching a manila folder with his personal report. It wasn't required, but after 2 decades of quiet complicity, he had decided silence was no longer a shield he was willing to wear. The officer at the desk, a tall woman with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense tone, looked up. "Can I help you?" Granger cleared his throat. "I'd like to file something." Voluntarily. She raised an eyebrow. "That's rare." He nodded. "That's the problem." She took the folder without another word and slid it into a bin marked active review. Just like that, the truth had a starting point. It wasn't grand. It wasn't dramatic. But it was real. Meanwhile, across the city, Elijah sat in a sunlit cafe, his hands wrapped around a warm cup of tea. He was staring out the window at the river, watching people pass with dogs, strollers, coffee cups, and unseen burdens. He wasn't thinking about himself. He was thinking about the system he'd once helped build, and the parts of it he'd failed to fix. When he had retired, Elijah thought he could leave the weight of duty behind. But yesterday reminded him, if you carry something long enough, it becomes part of your shadow. And your shadow never really leaves. It only waits for the light to bring it back. Julie entered the cafe a few minutes later. She spotted him and walked slowly toward his table, unsure of the right words, unsure if words would be enough. "Mr. Elijah," she said softly. "Thank you for meeting me." He nodded toward the seat across from him. She sat her hands, visibly shaking. "I wanted to say, I'm sorry," she said. "Not just for what I said, but for what I didn't see." Elijah studied her for a moment, then set his cup down gently. "Tell me," he said. "What didn't you see?" Julie's eyes glistened. "That fear? It made me default to suspicion. But it wasn't just fear of the theft, it was fear of difference. Of confronting the reality that I still carry biases I thought I'd buried." Elijah nodded slowly. Acknowledgement is the first honest brick in rebuilding trust. "I want to do better," she whispered. "I want to learn." "You're already doing it," he replied. "By being here." Outside, the city moved on, as it always did. But something in both their faces had changed. Guilt had softened into humility. Shame had reshaped into a quiet sense of duty. That evening, Granger did something he hadn't done in years. He showed up to a community town hall in Southside Chicago, not in uniform, but in a simple gray button-up and jeans. No badge, no belt, no buffer. Just a man sitting in a circle of folding chairs with residents who were tired of being afraid. He didn't speak at first. He just listened. Stories poured out. One woman described how her teenage son was frisked 3 blocks from home just for walking with a hoodie. An elderly man recalled being pulled over 4 times in 2 months with no ticket ever written. A young activist shared a story of her brother being detained outside a grocery store for matching a vague description. Granger took it all in his posture, humble. At the end of the night, when the facilitator asked if anyone from law enforcement had something to say, he raised his hand slowly. "I was that officer," he said, and I can't undo the years I misunderstood the very people I was supposed to protect. But I can say, this truth shines brightest in the shadows. And I'm standing here now because I don't want to hide from it anymore. There was no applause, just a moment of stunned silence. Then slowly, someone nodded. A second person murmured, "Thank you." And that was enough. Because transformation doesn't begin in the spotlight. It starts in the quiet spaces where one person chooses truth over pride, humility over defense. And in those shadows, light grows. The season shifted in Chicago, but something deeper had changed since that day in Millennium Park. Not just in the city's air, but in the quiet reckonings happening behind closed doors and within individual hearts. It wasn't the kind of change that made headlines. It was subtler, more human, rooted in choices made when no one was watching. For Officer Granger that morning had become a line drawn across the map of his life. Everything before it now felt distant, blurred by years of unchecked instinct and unspoken assumptions. And everything after was a slow, deliberate journey into accountability. He didn't wake up transformed. He woke up aware, and that awareness didn't let him rest. He volunteered to join a newly formed community liaison team, an initiative sparked by the conversations that followed the park incident. Once a patrolman of Streets Granger now walked school hallways, visited neighborhood centers, and sat with mothers who had taught their sons how to survive traffic stops instead of math homework. He heard pain. He saw mistrust. But in every voice, he also sensed a stubborn kind of hope, the hope that someone, anyone might finally listen and not turn away. Granger listened. And this time, he stayed. Julie took a different path. Her apology to Elijah had opened something inside her, a wound she hadn't realized she was carrying. She'd grown up believing she was on the right side of history. She'd read the books, said the right things. But that moment in the park forced her to confront the unexamined shadows within herself. So she started showing up. Not as a savior, not to be seen, but to learn. She joined a local restorative justice circle. Week after week, she sat in rooms where people shared their truths without filters. She didn't speak much at first, but when she did, it wasn't to justify, but to admit, to ask, to unlearn. Slowly, trust began to take shape, not as a handshake, but as a sustained presence. As for Elijah, he returned to Millennium Park often, not because of what happened, but because of what it became. That bench, once the site of suspicion, had become a gathering place. He met old friends there, chatted with tourists, and sometimes sat alone watching the way people moved. He found peace in the ordinary, a peace earned by a life that had walked through storms and never lost its compass. He didn't resume his badge, but he did return to mentorship. He spoke at cadet trainings, not with lectures, but with stories. Stories that made young recruits stop writing and start thinking. Stories about dignity, bias, silence, and courage. He never said the word racism with anger. He said it with clarity, and he told them what no manual could teach, that the uniform amplifies who you are, it doesn't hide it. At one such session, Granger sat in the back, no longer there to supervise, but to listen. When Elijah finished, their eyes met. There was no need for words. In that glance lived a full circle. And then there was one moment, quiet but profound. Julie returned to the park one afternoon and found Elijah sitting alone. She brought 2 cups of coffee. "I never thanked you," she said. "You already did," Elijah replied. "No," she said, sitting beside him. "I thanked you for proving me wrong. But I never thanked you for what you did after. You could have embarrassed me, called me out, made an example. I didn't want to win, Elijah said softly. I wanted you to see. Julie nodded, her eyes wet. I did. They sat in silence, the kind that doesn't demand conversation, just presence. From that day forward, the story wasn't about a stolen necklace. It wasn't even about a park or a badge. It was about what happens when truth is spoken gently but firmly, when dignity stands up without shouting, when power chooses restraint, when someone once presumed guilty becomes the reason others begin to change. Chicago didn't change overnight, neither did its systems. But small things did. Officers started introducing themselves before asking questions. Community boards were given real influence. Complaints were no longer buried. And young black boys walked past patrol cars with a little less fear in their chests. Change doesn't come in parades. It comes in footsteps, in benches, in words spoken across coffee cups, and in the unwavering belief that the past does not have to dictate the future. Elijah never told his story for applause. He told it so someone else wouldn't have to. And in doing so, he reminded them all, dignity isn't something you earn. It's something you honor, in yourself and in others, always. Elijah Brooks's story wasn't just about one afternoon in Millennium Park. It was about a lifetime of dignity tested and a single moment that revealed how quickly assumptions can dismantle truth. A 65-year-old retired black police chief, Elijah sat on a bench enjoying the golden hour of Chicago with strangers who saw his skin before his story. When a necklace went missing, suspicion fell not on the person with proximity to the truth, but on the man who had done nothing but exist with grace and quiet wisdom. What unfolded next was more than an accusation. It was a mirror reflecting the unconscious bias still deeply embedded in society. A white officer, guided more by stereotype than by evidence, approached Elijah with doubt already festering in his voice. His posture wasn't one of investigation. It was one of indictment, and he saw only what years of flawed conditioning had taught him to see. But what he didn't know was that Elijah had once trained men just like him. He had worn the badge not to assert power, but to protect integrity. And on that day, his experience was his armor. With calm precision, Elijah didn't just defend his innocence. He exposed a greater truth. He revealed the real culprit, someone no one had thought to question, not because of lack of proximity, but because of their assumed innocence. And in doing so, he held a mirror, not just to that officer, but to everyone watching. Julie, the woman who had sat beside Elijah just minutes before, suspicion clouded her view, came face to face with the harm of her silence. Her journey from complicit bystander to a woman of reflection and remorse became just as important. She didn't run from her mistake, she learned from it. And by choosing humility over denial, she helped transform a painful misunderstanding into a powerful reckoning. Officer Granger, too, was changed. Confronted by the reality of his own biases, he stepped beyond the uniform's comfort and into the vulnerability of accountability. His transformation wasn't about becoming a hero. It was about choosing to become human again. And Elijah? He walked away, not with bitterness, but with resolve. He used the very moment designed to reduce him to rise even higher, not in rank, but in impact. His story became a catalyst for change, for conversation, and for reflection, not just in police departments or courtrooms, but in homes, coffee shops, and classrooms. So what's the lesson here? The true power of this story lies not in its dramatic twists, but in the quiet truths it reveals about everyday life. It shows us that prejudice often hides behind politeness. That silence can wound as much as words. That dignity, when tested, can become a beacon. And that real change begins when we choose to listen, to question ourselves, and to act with humility instead of ego. In today's world, still struggling with racial tension, still battling unconscious bias, Elijah's story isn't a fable. It's a call to action. It reminds us to slow down, look deeper, and treat every person we meet not as a profile, but as a full human being with a story, a past, and a right to be seen in the light of their truth. If you've made it this far, it means this story stirred something in you. Maybe it challenged you. Maybe it made you reflect. Maybe it gave you hope. So here's our ask. If you believe in the power of stories like this, stories that hold a mirror to society, that challenge silence, that uplift dignity, then support us. Like this video. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. And hit that subscribe button. Because every time you do, you help us tell more stories that matter. Stories that open eyes, stir hearts, and just maybe change the world, one listener at a time.